Michigan football is different. It's spring ball. There's still a head coach wearing a skinny M on the hat. They're still in Glick Fieldhouse. You got a lot of the same players, but there are some new banners up in there. And Sherrone Moore is learning. He called it today about, and we'll get into this, but Greg Scruggs, the defensive line coach who was charged with an OWI, has resigned. He blew a .71, which is over double the legal limit. And I bring that up first to say that Sherrone Moore, basically stated today that it's life as a head coach. And, he learned early on that things come up and you have to adjust and make changes. And he's going to have to hire a new defensive line coach as well. But so yeah, it's life under Sherrone Moore is underway with Michigan a couple practices in.
Yeah. And I know for all the talk of, it's Sherrone Moore's the continuity hire and it's going to bring some stability. And, just when, and again, this isn't on him at all. Like Greg Scruggs made a very selfish, personal decision that that led to him resigning from a job that he was going to make quite a bit of money having, now that these coaching salaries are kind of out there. Would have made $650,000 this year. I think $725,000 next year. So it's hugely stupid, big ramifications for him. It's good to probably part ways there and open the search back up. But it keeps going back to, I feel like early on in this process when there was all of that change with guys going to join a Harbaugh and, trying to hire a staff and the background checks. And I know Sherrone had sort of compared it to, being the third and long where you're just keep trying to get ahead of the sticks. And, you feel like last week you finally get Tony Alford in there. The staff is set heading into spring football. And then the Scruggs situation happens. And it's just been, talk about a baptism by fire in terms of some of the quick things that can change and that can happen, when you're the man in the head chair. He's kind of been going through it. And I think in a lot of ways, them finally getting on the field is a good release for him. It's probably the most familiar thing he's done on the job at this point. But yeah, again, now we're right back to, we'll see what a timeline looks like on a replacement. I assume maybe they start calling up some of the other candidates they were talking to, but other schools are into spring ball now. So I don't know that everyone's going to be willing to jump ship midway through spring ball or after the start of spring ball, like maybe Tony Alford was, compensated very well to do so. Maybe we'll talk about that in a little bit, but so the search continues now. Just when you thought you were in a 3rd and 1 or so, there's a bit of a false start, and now you're back to 3rd and 6, and gotta figure something out there to get yourself finally with the chains moving and you having this operation going down the field. So it's unfortunate. I liked the background that Scruggs brought to the job, but clearly just he has some personal stuff that needs to get sorted out. And I think it's fair to say if this was a first-time offense, maybe that's something that you can come back from. But given that there is now a bit of a history with, the decisions he's made behind the wheel while intoxicated, it's probably best for both sides that they are parting ways. And now he can focus on getting himself right, and Michigan can get a coach that can be a leader of men and can lead by example and, be someone you can rely on in that coaching staff.
What could entice somebody to leave in the middle of spring ball is money. Wink Martindale, his salary just came out before we hit record here. He's going to make $2.3 million this year to be Michigan's defensive coordinator, 2.5 in year 2 and 2.7 in year 3. I think, usually anything that happens, we have to get mad at Ward Manuel. The fan base does. Pretty sure he stuck to his word when he said that he was going to increase that assistant coaching salary pool. They all got bumps up in salary. As you said, Scruggs, who has very little experience as an on-field assistant coach, was going to make $650,000 just a couple of years ago. I think Ron Bellamy was at like $250,000 or $300,000 coming from the high school ranks. This is a big difference. Of course, there's, I don't want to get into anything, but, like times have changed in terms of how much money's worth. Don't want to get into that. But that could help, certainly. And I think these becoming public today could help out as well. And something else I noticed, too, in talking to one of our Tennessee reporters at VolQuest about Brian Jean Mary coming over, is Sherrone Moore had the latitude to offer these guys 3-year deals, the assistant coaches. And Josh Heupel at Tennessee, who's been a head coach there for a few years, has done pretty well. he couldn't do it. He couldn't match. He wasn't allowed to give anything more than 2. And, that was a factor in that added level of security. So it does help that Sherrone Moore is being given resources around him to help this staff. But he talked about today as well, kind of his day-to-day is a little less football, a little bit more everything else. Sean McGee, the general manager, is helping in that aspect, and the numerous resources that they've kind of put around him in terms of support staff as well. But as far as the players, he said that there's a good vibe so far in the early going, really since they won the national championship to now. He said satisfied but not satisfied. We won a natty. That's it. That's not it. We want more. He said that's not a pun, by the way. So M-O-R-E, not 2 O's there with his last name. But yeah, I mean, it feels like, a couple practices in, we hear from just Sherrone Moore is the only guy we've talked to, but it seems like he's pretty pleased with the guys that are stepping up. Donovan Edwards, we've heard now a couple times, is more of a leader. The Mason Grahams, the Will Johnsons, they're still somewhat young. I mean, they're still technically in their sophomore year of college, entering their junior year in the fall, but those leaders are starting to come into shape just a little bit here as they start spring ball.
Yeah, and for all the bluster, or for how frenetic it was there for a few weeks where you're not sure what the coaching staff would look like, and you're talking about keeping the roster together. You start hearing about guys like Donovan Edwards and Mason Graham stepping up as leaders, Will Johnson stepping up as a leader, Rod Moore last week, in terms of football smarts and IQ, Don Martindale, Wink Martindale, as we all refer to him, the football world at large. It talks about him as a guy that reminds him of Eric Weddle. So, all of a sudden there is so much change, but, you look at in a lot of, spots on this roster, there's a lot of familiarity and there is a lot of carryover, especially on the defensive side of the ball. So again, sort of opening up saying that given how crazy the last couple months have been, just in terms of the hoopla of winning it all, and then the changes to the staff, to the operation, getting this team, which has a chance to, again, be a very good to maybe even great football team. We'll see what happens. A lot has to come together, but, you like to hear that, because it's not, anyone who's said, there's been like this argument that, oh, well, once you lose, don't get me wrong, like there's a drop off when you lose a Jim Harbaugh, but anyone who thought that there's going to be some sort of Rich Rod level of regression with this team, I just think it's completely outrageous. I mean, you've got 2 guys on your defensive line that could be first-round picks, maybe 3 or 4 of them if those defensive ends really pop this year. You've got 2 really good linebackers. Obviously, we know all the talent they have in the secondary. And then with Donovan Edwards, talking about a guy that, last week Kirk Campbell said looks a little more rocked up and looks like, a guy that's ready to take on that role as being a team leader, as being, that lead back in this system. So they have questions, don't get me wrong, but again, and what our coach is going to say, they're always going to kind of to fluff the roster a little bit. But right now, I mean, it's not like they're starting from ground zero with a lot of maybe getting familiar with assistants on the staff, but the defensive terminology, Wink talked last week about, a lot of that is going to carry over. The offensive philosophy more or less stays the same with Sherrone and Kirk Campbell calling the shots. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot more continuity here than I think people are willing to give Michigan credit for, which there might be some merit to that given all that's changed, but you look on paper and there's still a lot to like here.
One of the questions that you mentioned is quarterback, and as we kind of suspected and alluded to, but hadn't confirmed with somebody actually on the staff, is that Jack Tuttle is quote unquote working through something. So as much as things change, they will stay the same. The head coach will refer to injuries or guys not being around or limited as working through something. So you basically have 4 contenders currently as they go into spring ball at the quarterback spot: Alex Orji, Jaden Denegal, Davis Warren, Jaden Davis, and then Uncle Jack, as Sherrone said, the rest of the players call him, 24-year-old Jack Tuttle, who, again, is limited at this point. Don't know the extent of his injury, I think to the shoulder, but that's going to kind of hamper him a little bit as well. But I feel like it's nothing totally new. He talked about each quarterback, but still, as he said, in a broader sense, answering a question about the transfer portal in general, you go through spring ball you see what you have. So I think that's the process that they're kind of going through right now with the quarterbacks, and it's still early. They have 13 more opportunities to see these guys, including on Friday after the pro day.
Yeah, and I don't expect there to be a whole lot of clarity on this until we get a couple weeks into camp. Right now you're just getting your feet wet. You're getting a lot of the installs in. And I think that when you look at, I mean, to a certain extent, if Jack Tuttle is banged up a little bit, you're not going to get the full sense on what the entirety of the room looks like. But I think when it comes to how this battle will shake out again, I'm starting to pick up the pattern that when you ask about transfer portal, when you ask about position battles, the stock answer is pretty much going to be, yeah, we're always looking at everything. And yeah, we like what we have. So to me, I think, like I've said before, when it comes to this quarterback situation, I think over the next few weeks, what'll be worth watching is sort of the feedback, the stuff that's getting reported out of practices, maybe not even set up in press conferences. Obviously, we'll have stuff inside the fort and pass along things that we hear as they become available to us. But, if there's really an opportunity for someone from the outside to come in here and maybe add to that quarterback room and compete for the job, I would think Michigan's going to want that information out there, because then you need to start getting ducks in a row with what the collectives can offer, prospective guys that may enter the portal. Again, we always get asked about candidates. It's tough to even speculate on that until you know who's actually in the portal or who might be willing to get into the portal. I would think that whatever the feedback winds up being, if it's not up to their liking, we're going to start hearing about that, and you're going to start seeing maybe moves being made behind the scenes for maybe someone to get added.
On the flip side, though, it's like you don't want your current guys to leave, so they kind of have to play that delicate balance, and maybe some of that has to be behind the scenes. But then, there are going to be kids that come into the office and say, hey, I heard you guys offered this quarterback or that quarterback. It's, they only have 15 days to enter. If you're an undergraduate in the spring, it's going to be quite the delicate balance.
It is. And it's where I really think them getting off to a fast start and kind of evaluating what this is important, because let's be honest here. I mean, this isn't a quarterback battle where, you look around college football and usually sometimes it's between two guys. Sometimes it's between three. There are 5 guys here. So there are 4 players that are going to be upset or pissed off with where they are at in the pecking order. And, a few of them might be upset that they're 3rd or 4th or even 5th in that pecking order. So I really think there's a chance maybe there's some movement regardless. But yeah, I don't envy them. And I mean, it's another one of those chapters in what college football is now, where you're not only trying to keep guys on your own roster happy, but you're trying to re-recruit everyone, and you're looking in the portal and seeing how you can get better. I think that's why it's so important that they did bring in a GM like Sean McGee, because he's the type of guy that's going to head a lot of this sort of behind the scenes work and getting ducks in a row. Sherrone Moore, Kirk Campbell, they just need to coach the players up, and they can give feedback on maybe things that they might be looking for or a guy that they might like. But, their focus is going to be on coaching the team. Whereas administratively, you can't just opt out of some of those duties now, but you can sort of have a lot more assistance in that regard than maybe you did before. So it'll be interesting to see, no doubt.
Let's talk about breakout players. Sherrone mentioned 4 of them today, all on the defensive side, which is like the talent's already on that side of the ball. So it's not like it's overkill, because the depth isn't where they need it to be probably by the time the season comes around. Maybe you'd like to hear a little bit more about the offensive guys. He said he wouldn't name offensive linemen because they haven't been in pads yet, so that's kind of out of principle. And, he said that, smiling, of course, and said that, the offensive linemen get mad at him for that, but he doesn't care. DJ Waller Jr. at corner and Jair Hill at corner as well were 2 that he mentioned. He mentioned DJ Waller, length and that they're both phenomenal players. Jair Hill is a guy who played in the first few games of the year and then ended up redshirting, kind of fell off the map a little bit, maybe something off the field with a few freshman maturity issues, as our Chris Ballas has kind of talked about on here in the past. DJ Waller, though, was a guy who got some snaps at different points throughout last season, played a decent amount in that Michigan State game. he got burned, I remember, once against Purdue, but also, made a couple plays as well throughout the season in his limited opportunity. So I guess we can start with those two, and then there are two edge rushers, but that's pretty much the competition. I mean, when you look at it, I wrote an article today it came out this morning about the top position battles. Corner's one of them, and DJ Waller and Jair Hill, two guys entering their second year in the program, are going to be big factors there. Obviously transfer portal is a factor at any position. We could mention that at any point, but from what's on the roster, those two to me are kind of at the top of the pecking order in terms of guys that could play opposite of Will Johnson.
Right. And it's a situation too where I don't think it would hurt to add another body there if there's someone that pops up in the portal. Obviously last year we saw them add Josh Wallace after spring ball. So there's a lot of room to do that. But, to me now, don't get me wrong. I mean, what they were saying about Amori and Walker before he transferred in terms of the lateral movement, like all of that stuff, talked about him being an alien or whatever it was. You look at DJ Waller's profile, and again, I don't know exactly what sort of movement numbers he puts up, but you look at, he weighs in at 6'3", 205 last year, probably has a little more weight on him because I'm going off of last year's roster, but he's got the length. I think that, one of the biggest benefits of playing the quote unquote soft schedule that they did early last year is, remember Jesse Minter saying that they wanted to get, what was it, something like 26 or 28 guys into the game on defense.
Yeah, it was right around
fairly
there.
Early on. So, with guys like Waller, with guys like Jair Hill, who we didn't see a ton, it seemed like we saw a little more of Waller later in the year. But guys like that, like there's a little bit of film on them of seeing what they can do against, this level of competition. So freshman to sophomore years, where a lot of these guys make their biggest leap, I think from a cornerback room perspective, you can, not saying you don't need these guys to hold up their end of the bargain, but when you have a Will Johnson on the other side, who you assume can eliminate his side of the field, so to speak, and then you've got the safeties that they have, with the three guys that will be back, and Rod Moore, Makari Page, Quentin Johnson, it does, you need to play good football to get out on the field, but you're a lot more comfortable with the idea that, even if there is a bit of a drop off, so to speak, but I don't, you're able to sort of scheme around that. At the same time, as good as Josh Wallace was, he was just a well-rounded, really good college cornerback. You look at Jair Hill, he was a 4-star guy. You look at some of the physical tools that a guy like DJ Waller has. That competition is going to be a lot of fun to watch. And given the way that they like to rotate, I think there's plenty of room for both of those guys to make an impact.
I also don't think and we'll see, but the receiving cores that are on the schedule are quite as good as maybe an Ohio State or a Washington they had either. So yeah, like you can kind of scheme against that. Like early in the Ohio State game, and Josh Wallace wasn't really anywhere near Marvin Harrison Jr. until late in the game. Will Johnson goes out, and there were a couple opportunities. Like Ohio State did something that I thought was smart, kind of like a late shift where Marvin Harrison goes from wide on one side of the field all the way to the other, and they did get him on Josh Wallace. But when you do have one lockdown guy, I agree that can, you can kind of work with that.
Make no mistake about it too. Like Texas is going to throw the kitchen sink at these guys in week 2. So there is no 7.
Yeah, I guess they got Isaiah Bond, but even they're replacing a couple guys. I mean, Ewers is very good, but
I'm just saying in terms of having guys ready to play, there's not like that soft cushion into the season like maybe there was last year. So it's going to be
Fresno's going to throw the ball.
Yes, they are. So those first 2 weeks of the year, I mean, you got to have guys ready to go. So I think we're going to learn a lot about how they feel about that room over the next several weeks.
I'm not going to lie to you. I know nothing about Arkansas State, but that's a week 3 problem, and we'll get into that as the summer moves on.
USC is going to toss the ball around. So that's what, 3 of your first 4 games or so. Teams that are probably going to put a lot of stress on your pass defense.
For sure. Minnesota.
That's where the highest paid. That's where the highest paid defensive coordinator in college football should help you. You'd think.
That's a good point. So yeah, Wink Martindale, those guys, they do have, for as much as they're bringing back, a couple spots that are still kind of in flux, nickel being one of them. And I would say depth at edge being another. And that's where these next 2 guys that Sherrone Moore mentioned as breakout players early on, or at least guys that are impressing him early on in spring ball. TJ Guy, who he's I've been waiting his entire career for this guy to go from a guy to a dude, but TJ guy, it seems like he's getting there. And then Eno Etta, who's entering his sophomore year, and just a guy who, he was one of their top-rated signees last year, and there was so much depth at edge that, like, how are Cam Brandt and Eno Etta going to get on the field? They didn't much. Cam Brandt did a little bit more than Eno Etta, but they have some promising talent there, and it sounds like those two guys have stepped up. And to keep this defensive line rotation, whoever the assistant coach, the position coach is going to be, keep that rotation, I think, is really important, because that worked well last year, keeping guys fresh, having different bodies for different situations.
For sure. I think that's one of the bigger question marks on this team right now, is knowing how Michigan likes to rotate their edge guys. The guys that move, Josiah Stewart, Derek Moore, I think could be one of the better defensive line duos in college football. And maybe they take on a little more of a workload than Michigan pass rushers have of late. But, the guys ahead of them, Braden McGregor, Jalen Harrell, played a ton of snaps. So there are two spots on this depth chart, so to speak, full of guys that are going to play 300 snaps, 350 snaps this year, if they rotate the way that they'd like to. So I know Cameron Brandt was a guy that Chris Jenkins had kind of talked up. I think when we talked to him at the Rose Bowl, a guy that reminded him a lot of himself. TJ Guy, I feel like he's been under the radar for a few years. I wonder if he does legally change his name to TJ Dude if he's able to crack the lineup. But it seems like every time he gets out there, like, he makes some kind of, like, I won't say a wild play, but he's just always around the football. And I think that throwing him into that rotation, I think that will, maybe that's what helps him pop. But every time we've seen him play, I've always felt like he looks like he belongs. And it's just, when you go back and we'll look back at this team from the last 3 years for the rest of our lives and notice the depth there and be like, oh my God, like, you had good players that were 5 or 6 on the depth chart. So yeah, excited to see him get a little more time. Eno Etta as well. I believe last year he was their highest ranked signee. So there's still talent there. Again, the cupboard is not bare, people. It just has a lot of guys that, have played the role that they've played more so behind the scenes than on the field. But excited to see them get their opportunity, because I like what they have there.
You bring up a great point on TJ Guy. He's shown flashes of dudeness. Even his freshman year in 2021 at Maryland, he had a sack. He had a sack this past year in garbage time against Michigan State as well. But yeah, you're right. He does seem to flash when he's in there. Waller seemed to do that a little bit. Eno Etta didn't get that opportunity last season, but we'll see what he does. And you're right, Cam Brandt is probably right in that same mix. I mean, it just could be happenstance that Sherrone didn't mention him, but thought it was significant that he mentioned those four.